episode of Tech Rainmakers with Ashok Sudarshan, who is the CEO at Spiras Health. So, Spiras is a clinical company which is delivering specialized, personalized, and comprehensive healthcare to patients who are at an elevated risk of an emergency event or hospitalization. Spiras has been bridging the efforts of health plans, physicians, pharmacists, community resources, and creating efficient, smart, and scalable solutions. Ashok has primarily been working in the healthcare payer, in-home health services, and technology space for the last 20 plus years. And he has been working with the elite organizations like United Healthcare, Cigna Health Spring, Complex Care Solution, Magellan, and Longevity Health Plan. But I will now hand over to Ashok to share more about his personal and professional journey. So over to you, Ashok.
Great. Thank you for having me on this. I'm honored and deeply humbled by the opportunity to sit down and talk about my career. I came to the healthcare space after starting my career on the consulting large-scale systems side. I worked with what used to be called Andersen Consulting, what's now Accenture, right after I finished my graduate school career. And I was a little intimidated by technology at that point and thought, I'm not sure how long I'm going to last, but I'm going to try this thing out. And I really enjoyed the development world of large-scale computer systems, more on the design and implementation side than necessarily just the coding. So I did some coding at the beginning and then worked my way up much more on the program and project management side before really going into the sales side and business development. I was with Andersen for about 7 years, and then I had a young family at that time and was traveling every week. And we just made the decision that it made a little bit more sense to try and find something more permanent. And I was very fortunate that a number of my friends who were Andersen alums had gone to work at United Health Group. And we made a big joke at that time about we didn't know anything about healthcare, but we kind of knew about systems. And at a minimum, at least we would use the same methodology we knew while we were trying to build healthcare. So I got to United in 2003. It was just before some pretty major changes that happened in the healthcare world. And really got to grow at the same time that the business grew. So my plan to get into healthcare was more driven by technology background and relationships than it was driven purely by love of healthcare. But I think all of us have figured out the healthcare system doesn't work the way that it is, even after years and years and millions of dollars being poured into it. And it continues to evolve. And I think, I'm sure we'll get to this in our discussion, but probably the most important part of this thing is that evolution has led to many different business models. If you think 20 years ago about PBMs, or you think about digitization, or you think about customer service and requirements versus where we are now, many of these businesses wouldn't have survived 20 years ago. Yeah. So I think it's important when you think about healthcare, it's not just delivery from the payer side or the provider side. It's an ecosystem that now is continuing to grow and has expectations and its fingers in everything. And, we all know that probably 60% of every dollar on the taxes side goes into Medicaid, Medicare, some other form of healthcare. So it's here to stay. And we all have a big reason to make it work better than it does currently.
You mentioned that when you entered the space, there were big changes happening. So it'll be great to just hear what were those big changes happening in the healthcare space that kind of drew a huge bunch of you to move into this space.
Yeah, I think there are 2 or 3 things that were pretty big for us. So one was certainly Medicare Advantage, which is a program sponsored by the federal government, but involves a combination of a public and private partnership. There had been a lot of legislation going around trying to decide whether or not that program was going to go away. And so people were on pins and needles. And what ended up happening was the government did support that. This is right around the early 2000s, 2003, 4, 5. And the federal government decided to really step up and enhance the way that the program was structured, and then allow insurance companies to really aggressively market. So as a result of that, Medicare really took off. And a number of people in the 65 and over age group who had financial means, which is always the lifeblood of any business, were opting into Medicare Advantage. So there was tremendous growth that happened, and certainly at United, but also at a number of other places. I think second thing that happened was in 2006, the federal government under the Bush administration pushed forward the Part D program for prescription drugs. We never had a plan that was quite like that in the days before. It had always been included in your insurance benefit. But Part D really unleashed a tremendous amount of buying power from the federal government. And the second side of that was a tremendous need for systems launching. So we at United managed to put in a fairly nice state-of-the-art system in record time, 6 months or so, by suspending some rules within our inner hierarchy. But more importantly from that, we managed on the first 3 days of the launch of that system to land 4.5 million members. So the thought that you could launch a program with that much support and have 4.5 million members join in a very short period of time, I think, again, that kind of rapid change does not happen very often. And here we were kind of at the crossroads of that. And we were the most successful program, but there were several others that were multi-million members who got on board. And I think the payoff was seniors were getting a much better deal on drugs than they ever had before, including access. And then I think the third big thing was the expansion of the Medicaid program. So many states started appropriating funds and then making block grants and launching programs in their states that were a combination of not just for seniors, but also for children. We had this children's program, CHIP, that really expanded across the country. And so all of a sudden, we had this tremendous growth in all of the programs because there was all of a sudden money that had been appropriated in programs that were structured for it. So very exciting time to be in the business. Now we're going into this maturity scale of trying to figure out exactly how to continue to enhance the benefits that are in place.
Okay, so as I listen to you, I also sense that there is huge amount of data that kind of flowed into the system after all these changes happened. That's when you kind of entered this space also. And with data comes the issues of data security and management. So, and all this data is fairly sensitive, right? It's all about people's health and everything. So what is your perspective on that? How difficult a issue that is for your particular industry?
So I think obviously people are extremely sensitive about healthcare data, probably more so other than maybe their own credit and banking information, where they get nervous about a credit card being hacked or a bank account being tapped. Almost every study you say says that at least on credit or on checks and things like that, bank accounts, credit cards, it's only a matter of time before something ends up happening. Almost everyone you meet will give you a story about that kind of thing. I think the same is probably true in healthcare. It's a matter of when your company is going to get hacked, not so much if. And, sadly, when you think about some of the hackers who are involved, they go after hospitals and shut down the delivery of drugs and things like that as a ransom. You would think you'd have at least a little bit of a conscience of not attacking people who are at their worst possible and most vulnerable moments at that. But we have to deal with the reality of these people are not necessarily very ethical. I think the flip side of that is you can spend an inordinate amount of money trying to protect your company and you're still probably going to get hacked. So the issue is, where do you draw the balance between doing everything that's logical and capable? How do you continue to be vigilant with keeping an eye on your regular systems penetration testing and the things that are like that? And then what's really your preparation that you immediately snap into place when something ends up happening? And I think in the various companies that I've worked at, whether I think about, we had large scale hacking when I was at Magellan, for example. Obviously, United and Cigna and HealthSpring get hacked on almost a regular basis and constantly investing more and more money and doing that kind of stuff. But even here at a small company like Spiras, where we are just getting started with kind of a new care delivery model and some other types of things, we do have, we can see regular penetration attempts that happen across our data sets. And with things sitting in the cloud now, it's not even my servers that I have to worry about in the locked closet and worrying about it. It's now about, I've spent some money for somebody else, but I'm very dependent on them. And I think what we all take into consideration is, it's great that Amazon, who's our provider, gives security and invests millions and billions of dollars in doing this. But if we have a breach, it's our problem. It's not Amazon's problem. I can go to Amazon for some counsel, et cetera. So I would just summarize this by saying a couple of things. It is only a matter of time before something ends up happening. You should have a plan immediately ready for what you're going to do if and when that type of activity occurs. You should do what you can on balance with, let's say, 1 to 2% of your annual revenue being spent on protection, security, and paying attention. And I think you need to communicate with your employees to be vigilant on a regular basis. And I'm not just talking about door security, which I think is important, physical security, but also really just anything that's going on, because it's almost always something inadvertent that causes the access. And unfortunately, it's here to stay. So I think if we take off our hat on the execution side and we think about us as individuals, do I think that there's a good likelihood over the course of my lifetime that while I was a client of Blue Cross Blue Shield of wherever that somebody got to my data. Yeah, it seems only like it's logical.
You have made an interesting point about, getting everyone involved, especially your people, because yes, you're right. That's where most of the things start going wrong. So what have you done at Spirus to make sure that that thing is in order, right? How have you brought your non-tech team, so to say, on track with what is important and what they should be doing?
Yeah, so I think the two biggest things that we do is we have regular reminder that goes out in email
Hmm.
probably every week or 2 weeks about here were a couple of episodes that we saw, so be vigilant about this. If an example came to one
Hmm.
of our
Hmm.
people, we try to share that across the company. I think the other thing is that we try and spend a fair bit of time within the company doing our own analysis of what have we seen in terms of looks that are coming into the company. What are we doing? And we use an external service for doing that. I don't want people
Okay.
to be biased just about what we have
Hmm.
in-house. We're a small company, so the thought that we would have a security analyst, just we can't really afford to devote one person to that full time. And that
Hmm.
skill set is so specific now in terms of what people are looking for that it's much
Hmm.
better to buy into a service. So we went to a company here in town that does provide that service. They have a variety of technology services, and we
Hmm.
asked them to run protection tests, penetration, review what attempts have been made across our data, et cetera, over the last bit, and try and keep up with that. Also try and pay attention to what their recommendations are. Hey, we've heard some chatter that these are the types of entities that
Hmm.
should be a little bit concerned about what's going on. Try and be a little bit more vigilant around that.
Yeah.
And then just the last thing, Anupam, because you asked a great question, we are absolutely adamant about this physical security. There's
Hmm.
no piggybacking through the door. Everybody's got to sign the logs. And
Hmm.
because we're a small company, it's much easier for us to keep an eye on that right now. But we want to build that culture of security and compliance, and that it's everybody's responsibility from the beginning, as opposed to trying to catch up after we become a company of 200,
Yeah.
300, 500 employees.
Yeah. Interesting. I would like to take a small jump back into the past here
Sure.
because I was going through your profile and it said something about you working at Anderson. So, what exactly were the different projects probably at Anderson which kind of were related to tech space, and how was your experience there?
Yeah, so as I said, I started in the kind of typical plan at Anderson back in the day. This is 25 years ago when I got started there, but we used to go
Huh,
to a boot camp at the beginning for the first 6 weeks, three
huh,
weeks in your local office, and then 3 weeks in the training center in Illinois. So I
huh,
went through that and then immediately got placed on a project where, hey, you got to write some code and then you got to
huh.
test it and do all that kind of stuff. So I was a little intimidated by that, but got through the process. At that time, we were working on a large scale custom system for the state of Texas that
Okay.
was focused on child abuse prevention, the things that are related to that. So, welfare and how do we keep people in communication with one another. Using the technology that was rampant, but we started looking at how much money was being spent on a system like that, and it was
Hmm,
ridiculous. I mean, the
hmm.
numbers didn't make sense to me at that time, but when you start doing the economics on what it costs to deal with abuse and deal with
Yeah.
child welfare, obviously the dollars made a lot of sense and keeping people in communication. Very quickly after that, I moved over to working instead on a system that provided payroll and personnel for all state of Texas employees. And that project used a package system. So it was the first time I'd moved from doing custom work to
Hmm,
doing package system. And I didn't realize how package systems work. So
hmm,
very interesting experience for us for a little more than 2 years. And then again got into a situation where there was a product that had come out that had become quite popular in the commercial space called
hmm,
PeopleSoft. And at that time, PeopleSoft was making its move into the public sector space, and I had specialized in doing government systems. So
hmm,
I then spent the next 3.5 years working, 4 years working on large scale PeopleSoft implementations in a variety of geographies: Texas, Louisiana, Minnesota, and then in California. And I had come back to Minnesota after, as I said, I was commuting every week, and we had
hmm.
this young family. And it was at that point we decided that it was probably good to try and find something different to do that would provide me a little bit more stability in home life than being on the road all the time. I still miss those days at Anderson's. Great company. I learned a lot working there about
Yeah.
not just technology and project management, but more
Hmm,
importantly, really how to structure business processes.
yeah.
Because I think that the biggest issue that we run into on the technology side is people who are sitting on the business side are not good at giving requirements. And
Hmm,
so the systems everybody ends up being unhappy. And it's usually because of the translation between what the business wants
yeah.
and what technology builds. There's a gap that's sitting in there.
Hmm. So how do you kind of manage these two kind of disparate teams at your space, the tech
Yeah, I
and
think
the business?
it's actually a great question. Part of the reason I think I migrated from a pure technology career into more on the business operations side and strategy and product design side was exactly around that. I think the
Hmm.
systems and the technology work has evolved so much now to where you can code pretty much anything very quickly as long as
Hmm.
the requirements are good. But as I said, I felt like that people who were sitting on the business side were never really eloquent about what they were looking for.
Yeah.
So I even during the days of when I was the CIO of a large organization, I used to tell people I kind of feel like I'm fake. I'm much more of a business guy who is hiding in IT clothing than an IT guy who's sitting around trying to figure out how to digitize or automate or do different types of process things. So I feel like my key skill set is in really making sure that those requirements are much more eloquent and going through an iteration. The
Hmm.
move from waterfall to agile as a methodology really supported that activity because
Hmm.
all of a sudden now it was let me iterate. The
Hmm.
challenge is having discipline and commitment of resources to actually making those things come to fruition.
Hmm.
And then last thing I'll say is the mentality of most system implementation houses and project management, et cetera, is almost all on the delivery of the system. It's
Hmm.
not on the testing and then on the
Hmm.
ongoing operation and evolution of the system. So the
Hmm.
mentality has to be I'm putting money in to build something on the front end, but I'm going to continue to care and feed it just like
Yeah.
a plant. I'm not just sticking it in the ground the first day. I got to keep watering it. I got to keep spending time and money, and most importantly, really good resources on it. I
Hmm.
think that's really been more of my, I won't say claim to fame, but more of where I'm passionate is around it. If we're going to do it, it's not just a 1 year commitment. It becomes part of the lifeblood of the organization. And we've all seen systems that get starved. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's essential. I mean, the system has to keep evolving, and it has to be given that, that energy to keep evolving. I'll make another jump back into the past because I've been dying to ask
sure.
this question. Yeah, education was in political science. So how did this, even at Anderson, you were doing more tech based projects. So how did this transition happen for you?
Yeah, a couple of things. I went to college thinking that I wanted to study economics, and I took a couple of economics classes, and they were interesting. I took a couple of political science classes, and they were more interesting, and I did better in them. So I thought, you know what, I better focus on political science. I had initial aspirations when I was in college about going to law school, but I think
Okay.
what I found after I was in working on my political science degree was I was interested more in writing and some analysis that was going
Hmm.
on, and then
Hmm.
really practical applications in the business world fit me much better than the theoretical discussions of
Yeah.
lawyers. So when I came out from college, I worked for a couple of years in the hotel business, and then I went
Hmm.
back to business school. And in business, I focused on finance and marketing, a little bit of general management.
Hmm.
But in specific answer to your question about this transition, I think two things were really important to me. One was all political systems are built on some amount of a combination of providing resources
Hmm.
to whoever wants it and trying to figure out what the landscape is of the system, what will be popular, what's the right thing to do, what's the short term
Hmm.
versus the long term. So for me, political science and the study of a bunch of systems over a period of time, political
Hmm.
systems over time,
Hmm.
were really the application to the business world. How can I be successful at continuing to move an organization forward? What are the micro patterns
Hmm.
or things like that really get duplicated? The second thing I thought, which was probably far more important, is looking at various concepts and
Hmm.
then applying those concepts to business. So if I think about that, I think about I went through training at Anderson. We were rigorous around testing being probably the most important thing you can do. And the earlier you test, the better your long-term results are going to be.
Hmm.
So when I got to Anderson and I got that concept through these first 6 weeks of boot camp, and then we went somewhere, I was much more concerned about understanding what my test plan was going to be than I was
Hmm.
just about the core development. Because I figured we can catch up on the testing, we can iterate, we can show people how things work.
Hmm.
But if you missed that at the very beginning, you never would have understood it. I think the second thing was, as I shared with you, this whole idea about a system is not just about developing it, dropping it off, and then walking out the door. It's
Hmm.
also about this long-term care and feeding. So for me, political science and the aspects of looking at different, things that got repeated over history and concepts
Hmm.
and then applying them to business situations has been
Hmm.
probably the most successful part of my career.
Wow. I want to ask you one more question, which is a little personal. Which is your favorite book? Because somebody who is coming from that background would have a lot of reading that's going on. So, which is your favorite book?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question. We bop this around in my family quite a bit, but I think there are two
Okay.
that sum me up. One is a book that was written by a very famous mystery or spy author named, and that was a pseudonym for him. But this book is called Shibumi. It's a story
Okay.
of a guy who's an assassin, and then he has to go through some fairly challenging types of things. But the book is
Huh,
written beautifully, and it is a
huh,
combination of not just his work, which he has to
hmm,
do, but also his personal relationships.
hmm,
And it's also extremely exciting.
hmm.
And then the second is a book that was written by Roald Dahl called Danny, Champion of the World. It's a story of a widower and his young son and some adventures that they have together.
Oh,
And
okay.
my dad and I were very close and spent a lot of time having some adventures also. So for me, it was a nice theme around thinking about it. Again, also, he's the same guy who wrote
Hmm.
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the
Ah,
Giant Peach.
yeah,
So
yeah.
a very gifted author, and it was a book I read, I think, when I was in grade school, but I read it to my children too. So it always brings back good memories.
Okay. Any business book that really kind of is close to your heart or
Yeah, I think
makes a
there are
lot of
two. I
sense?
think so. One is Good to Great, which everybody's read. I think the
Hmm.
challenge with reading Good to Great is, it's big, long, pithy kind of thing, but I think it's really sums itself up in probably 3 or 4 points, which are
Yeah.
good for people to understand. And then the second one, which was surprising to me, was a book called Managing Expectations. And I think the biggest thing in there is, we're all pleasers when we're working in our business careers or
Hmm.
technology careers, or really career in any way.
Hmm.
We're all trying to please somebody who's further up the food chain, or in this day and age, often it's, can we keep our employees happy one way
Hmm.
or the
Hmm.
other? The biggest challenge we have is we never are clear about what are the expectations of each other.
Hmm.
So I remember one time my boss had come to me and said, "Hey, listen, I need you to do this." And
Hmm.
I had learned from this book, okay, I have a list of 12 things you've asked me to do. So where does this fit in the priority list, and when do you need it by? I
Hmm.
didn't used to ask questions like that. I
Hmm.
think the same thing is true about when I sit down with my employees or
Hmm.
my colleagues and we're talking about things that are going on in the organization. I try
Hmm.
to be fairly cognizant of when you said that, what specifically do you mean, and when do you want it to be done by, and what
Hmm.
are the resources that you think we should spend on it, etc. And I think what you have is then, in a world of imperfect and constant communication, there's text, email, phone
Yeah.
call, all the stuff we're trying to keep up with. At least it's a way to stay on something, be a little bit more
Hmm.
focused with one another.
Oh, interesting. So that's quite a journey from adventure and rather mystery adventure and then or adventure mystery and then coming to more managing expectations. Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
I think that my love of those books, whether they be spy books or detective novels or things like that, is also some escapism, because the business world is fairly intense. Sometimes it's nice to disappear into a book or a TV show and
Yeah,
really be anonymous for a little bit.
that's true. That's so true. Okay, now let me bring you back to the technology domain. So digital transformation is another the buzzword, and everybody has their own understanding and their own view of it. What does digital transformation look to you in your industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've learned a couple of lessons through this. One is,
Hmm.
digital transformation is again a buzzword, and it means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So when I say it in our organization, I again try and do a little bit of preaching, or doing what I preach, by asking the question, what really is the expectation on digital transformation? So
Hmm.
one is, I think we have to continue to look at how do we make the business easier for people to engage. The number
Hmm.
one problem we have in healthcare is that the member does not engage with the system. And so therefore,
Hmm.
for whatever reason, it's not necessarily their fault. Sometimes it's intimidating, sometimes it's a language barrier,
Hmm.
sometimes it's an access problem, sometimes it's affordability. But in all
Yeah.
those cases, what are we doing to empathize what it's like to be the patient or the patient's caregiver trying to
Hmm.
access the system? I think the corollary to that, or the result of that, is you start to think about what are the multimodal ways that we could start to engage people. So is it
Hmm.
texting? Is
Hmm.
it door knocker campaign? Is it
Hmm.
calling them on a regular basis? Is it
Hmm.
video and telehealth? We all
Hmm.
learned during the pandemic
Hmm.
that we wished we'd had telehealth more ingrained in how we were going
Hmm.
to deliver from
Hmm.
before, because
Yeah.
there was so much capability that was really there, not only in terms of protecting yourself, but also in terms of making it easier to keep people on a regular routine
Yeah.
about what's working. We spend a significant amount of time at Spiras, and actually some of the other companies that I've been at, trying to think about how do we continue to appeal to people and what
Hmm.
are the things that will keep them engaging with the system. So
Hmm.
is that the personal touch of I've given you your own cell phone that came from our company, but I know we can reach each other? Is it some
Hmm.
kind of a digital platform like an iPad? We did a test run at one company I was at with iPads in the nursing home. And
Hmm.
what we found was the members really just didn't like them. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. There was some, it was very cumbersome. The networks that
Hmm.
exist within the facilities are not particularly great. So
Hmm.
it caused more frustration than it was for satisfaction.
Hmm.
I think we need to continue to try different methods of doing this. I think the third thing that we all need to spend a lot of time on is recognizing the folks who are seniors today are not the most technology savvy.
Yes.
So we have a little bit of a cycle here, but the caregivers who are providing or their contacts, their children
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
people who are helping to take care of them are fairly tech savvy. And so
Yes.
we need to remember in all cases, it's not that somebody's talking to Ashok's mother. Sometimes they're
Hmm.
talking to Ashok, and I do have
Hmm.
expectations of how things are going to go.
Yeah.
So we need to remember we got to appeal to a couple of other people. And
Hmm.
last thing that again, I think is a result of that is we have to build that infrastructure now because as people
Hmm.
like me, et cetera, start to age into the system, our expectation level of what we're going to get on a digital basis is going to
Hmm.
skyrocket. It will
Yeah.
absolutely not be a world in which people think I have to call somebody to schedule an
Hmm.
appointment. I
Hmm.
should be able to go to Calendly and just put something in there. I'm not going to be, and you're not going to be satisfied with a world in which somebody's not willing to come to my house. So
Yeah.
Spiras, we focus a lot on delivery of care at home. Part of that just being that's where the expectation level is.
Hmm.
So I think this is a rare window that we have where we should be spending a lot of time on building delivery capability and
Hmm.
probably overbuilding. We'll spend a little bit too much on portals. We'll probably spend a little bit too much on tools and technologies
Hmm.
and web presence and things like that. But the payoff pitch will be a group of people who had not bought into the system will now
Hmm.
start to engage. And if we can quickly get them to engage, we can keep them engaged in the system.
Wow. The word that actually stayed with me throughout this, the biggest word was empathy. Empathizing with your customer. And I also found this interesting that there are two sets of users here, one who is not tech savvy and one who would be tech savvy and would have expectations. So how are you currently managing it? Right, I understand that 10 years down the line we will have users who are tech savvy, but right now with two disparate groups, how are you and your company managing that?
Yeah, the biggest things that we do are related
Hmm.
to physically taking somebody and deploying them in the member's house so
Hmm.
that we can actually have an interaction with them. So
Hmm.
in our care delivery model, a lot of times what needs to happen is a nurse practitioner needs to be talking to the member,
Hmm.
but the cost of deploying a nurse practitioner to a member's house is cost prohibitive. We just can't
Yes.
make money doing that, and an insurance
Hmm.
company won't pay us for doing that activity. So our model instead is we have a therapist or a CMA or somebody LPN or RN who actually after being scheduled drives to the member's home
Hmm.
appointment, goes into the home, and then launches telehealth so that the
Yeah.
NP can have the communication back and forth. So we basically facilitate that communication.
Hmm.
And then when we are leaving and scheduling the follow-up appointment, we work
Hmm.
through, would you like it to be telehealth again? Would you like it to
Hmm.
just be a phone call? Would you like a
Hmm.
text? Would you like a
Hmm.
portal? So we give them the opportunity to kind of look through what is the right method for
Hmm.
communication. And then we have tools like RPM where we drop off, a pulse ox or we've got a weight scale and all they have to do is step on it. We can text them,
Hmm.
just a reminder, Mrs. Smith,
Hmm.
please go stand on the scale. And then we get
Hmm.
some readings and we can keep an
Hmm.
eye on that member. If something is a big shift from day 1 to day 2, we immediately call or deploy somebody to
Hmm.
go back out there. But it is this combination of facilitating the communication with
Hmm.
those people right now that's the most important because not everybody is meticulous about doing this and not
Yeah.
everybody has the means. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
again, just going back to your empathy comment or our empathy comment, I think one of the other things is, I'd like to think that we have some pretty good resources in my family. I've been in healthcare. My brother and sister-in-law are both
Hmm.
doctors.
Hmm.
And we struggled with figuring out ways to get my mother the care that she needed, and same for my father. I
Hmm.
can't imagine what it would be like if you are indigent or if you don't speak the language or you don't have
Right.
anybody to help you. And so we have to keep working at this and trying to figure
Hmm.
out, how do we get out into the community? How do we use resources like a church group or
Hmm.
some other religious affiliation, or even
Wow.
getting to these shelters and start to
Hmm.
take care of these people on a proactive basis?
Wow. Wow. That's really impressive. Uh, so there are you talked about using different modes to reach your end customer. Uh, bu- but is there a huge cost differential when you look at all these different modes, or it really doesn't matter because you're leaving the choice to them? That means whatever they pick, you have to give them. So is there a cost differential for the company, and is there sometimes a preference for one mode and aversion to the other one? Have you ever faced that? Does that exist in the industry?
Yeah, I think, look, there's always this, what's the word I'm looking for? There's always some tension between the clinical side that wants clinical
Hmm.
excellence and quality
Hmm.
versus the financial side in any organization. I think the same thing
Hmm.
is true here. And I'd love to be in a world in which we could deploy an NP in a helicopter every day to go and see members, but
Yeah.
obviously it's cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
What I think is probably more important as we look through the model is a combination of the people who would need to have a physical touch point on a
Hmm.
regular basis are
Hmm.
probably the people that are costing the most in the system.
Yeah.
So if they need a lot of high touch or they're
Hmm.
asking for it, it's probably a sign that we should be spending more time with them anyway so that we can drop their medical cost. And
Hmm.
over time, that should stabilize.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
think the second thing is, if that's not the case and people are asking for a lot of physical touch or
Hmm.
communication for somebody to be there, it could be a sign that they're lonely. And
Hmm.
I don't have to deploy an NP if somebody's lonely. I can deploy a social worker. There are other
Hmm.
methods for doing that. So I think some of that is around recognizing highest and best use of the personnel that we have.
Hmm.
And then I think the third thing is, there are clearly cases where we can determine for ourselves and make a recommendation.
Hmm.
Listen, Mrs. Smith, what you really need is for us to check on you once a week on Tuesdays, because it really seems like after the weekend, you've eaten some bad stuff and you don't feel good on Monday.
Hmm.
And Tuesday's really the day where we should check on you. Let us start with a phone call and then we can evolve. And if you ever need us, of course, we'll be there. We'll find that educating the member about that process
Hmm.
is super successful. So some
Hmm.
of it is they just want to be heard, and then
Hmm.
they're willing to try something. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But we do, part of the reason we have these multimodal approach, I think, is
Hmm.
because we do recognize that different people do and want different things. And as much as I think it's great to be in the house, I would much prefer 4 responses to a phone call than that
Hmm.
3 times I deploy people and they didn't answer the door, they weren't there, because
Yeah.
then nobody's happy with the system.
Yeah.
So we're always evolving and trying to figure it out. We don't always get it right, but I think having more options there is really the answer to the question.
Hmm. Uh, So you have in the healthcare domain also you've worked across different organizations and you have also worked in different sectors. Is there a in the technology space, have you found that there is a theme, there is a repeatability of certain things, or do you feel that every organization and every sector comes with its own set of problems and own set of solutions? What has your experience been?
I think the fundamental thing is the basics that we need to do about the
Hmm.
transfer of data. So if you know, everyone likes to make this comparison though between
Hmm.
healthcare and banking. If you
Hmm.
and I both go to an ATM in Turkey, and we put our card in, we absolutely expect the money to come out. There's
Yeah.
no, you got a link to my bank, I'm not paying a transaction fee, none of that stuff.
Hmm.
If we go anywhere in the world and we pick up the phone, we expect to hear a dial tone. There could be a
Hmm.
storm raging, whatever. We might be a little less frustrated with, I lost my cell signal or my satellite signal to my TV set, but there's never a case in which we don't expect to pick up the phone and hear dial tone.
Yeah.
But for some reason in healthcare, we tolerate the fact one person will say, send me an 835, and
Hmm.
you send a standard transaction, but it's not really a standard. I need this field, I need that field. So
Hmm.
one constant throughout this is an inordinate amount of money and time and energy gets
Hmm.
spent on what should have been standardized a long time ago. And we have to find a way to get that done, because it's awful all the way around. The
Hmm.
government standards should be mandated. We should make
Hmm.
things much simpler, and standard transactions should go back and forth, not just between payer and provider, but also back and forth to the federal government in terms of the requirements that are coming. And
Hmm.
we're all complaining about it. Second thing is, no matter how quickly an insurance company pays, the doctor's office is always unhappy with claims quality, reimbursement, et cetera. And again, that's a historical battle that has been going on for years. You will not go to an insurance company or a provider's office where that is not topic number one. I submitted the claims, they didn't pay me. They didn't submit the claims, or they tried to overcharge me. So I don't think those things are ever going to go away. I think they're just the nature of the business world and how those transactions happen. And unless we get into a world like a Kaiser or some of the things that United is doing today, where they buy the practice, and so therefore it's one complete system, that thing will continue to be a problem, right? Because the people who are involved, they have natural tension that exists within the system. So I would tell you that those are endemic problems that I've seen from wherever. I think where the evolution continues to happen, though, is much more on the analytics side, where we have gotten so much more sophisticated in our ability to analyze the data, and we have bigger and bigger data sets. You'd asked this question before, but we are so much better about getting data into places and being able to run analysis and determine both actuarially and from a clinical standpoint, what are the best protocols. We do a significantly better job of taking care of people today than we ever did. That's why lifespans have increased so much. And it's part of the reason that I think you've seen so much of a proliferation of the services companies that are in members' homes or in different caregiving slots than there used to be. Just think, in the old days, you were at home, you got sick, you went to the hospital, you were in the hospital for a week or 10 days, then you went back home. Now it's, should I go to a skilled nursing facility? Should I go to an outpatient clinic? Can the service be done in my house? Should I take pills? As opposed to those types of things. And we see that the quality of life has really increased quite a bit. So I think that we'll continue to see evolution on this service delivery at the last mile problem, much more than anything else, where folks are getting more and more sophisticated around designing programs. And we'll see money flowing more into those types of demonstration programs than anything else. It should be encouraging to everybody, though, as a result of it, because it can be a tremendous amount of technology development that goes into it. Devices, large scale systems work that goes on, web presence, communication, et cetera. Tremendous amount of development that's going to happen in this space.
So what is that one technological advancement that you are kind of waiting for or looking forward to in your domain or anywhere else?
I'm not so sure that I can limit it to one, but I think one thing that we all need to start figuring out is how are we going to be passing data from ourselves as individuals into some kind of an ongoing maintenance system. So we have Fitbits, we have wearables. We now have so much of a proliferation in terms of remote patient monitoring that's gotten a lot better. But it's going to be, what is the one thing that we can do? Is it going to be an implant? Is it going to be, something you swallow? Is it going to be some other type of thing that passes data back and forth? I think the second thing that we need to see is not so much a technology advance, but it's going to be, how do we start setting the expectation and accountability back on the individual for taking care of themselves? The number one predictor for what your long-term health is going to be is not genetics. It's you as an individual and what you do to take care of yourself. So a lot of people hide, say, well, I'm overweight or I have diabetes because it runs in my family. Well, if we're ever going to break the cycle, it's going to be because a generation or two starts to eat better, starts to exercise more, starts to pay attention to the types of things. We have more information than we ever did before. But we don't hold people accountable to that, with the sole exception of maybe different premiums for people who are smokers versus non-smokers. If somebody in this country wants to sit around and eat a Big Mac every day and weighs 500 pounds, their insurance rates in their company plan are exactly the same as somebody who runs marathons. And to me, that's going to continue to create not just a cost problem, it's going to cause tremendous amount of jealousy in the system, because people are like, I'm paying for somebody and I'm doing everything I can to try and keep my health well, and I'm not successful. So it will be using that data to hold people accountable.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. Catching the data and then using it to hold people accountable. And then you talked something about, swallowing something which will capture the data. That was going back into the domain of sci-fi.
That's right.
So my last question to you, which it's right on dot now, that what would you tell a younger you if you could meet him today?
I think there are two things that I would suggest. So one is, it's going to continue to evolve. And so the nature of business should not be, generations before mine, they were all, I went to a company, I worked there 35 years, I retired and went on. And the thought that you had to go from one company to another, I won't say it necessarily was anathema, but it was always, well, why? Why'd you make a change after 10 or 15 years? Why did you go someplace else? I think that model has changed completely. And now there are going to be new and exciting things that are going on all the time. So I would encourage people to just recognize if you're working on something you don't particularly care for right now, I think it's important that you continue to keep your eyes open and not feel like you'll be judged because you picked up and moved to another location. I think the second thing is to have courage to do what is right. I think we all get lectured, whether it's in business school or in reading the books and things like that, about find something that you're passionate about and do that. I get that. And I think people have already preached it, so I don't need to. But I think people need to have real courage about what they think is the right thing to do and to pursue that in their businesses. And that's not just from a leadership perspective where Ashok is sitting in a meeting and has the opportunity to influence where the company is. I think it happens at every level. And I want people to have integrity because at the end of the day, that's the only thing you have other than your name. And we read these business scandals that happen on a regular basis in so many businesses right now. And we know that the net effect is not just for the individuals in the company, but it's for shareholders, it's for families, it's for the people who are affected. So I think if we start to build a world of integrity again, or build on the world and focus on integrity and courage in business and in the decision making and in doing what's right, I think we're going to find very quickly, much like the folks who talk about climate change say, we just need to stop and focus on doing some things and then the world will get better very quickly. I think we're going to find that we're in a much better place in a very short period of time.
Wow, that's really inspiring, Ashok. You're right that if there is no integrity, I mean, everything else is just kind of a fluff over and above that. So, thank you so much for your time. It was amazing listening to your stories, your experiences, and the wisdom gems also. So, thank you so much for your time. And for our viewers who are watching this, if you have any questions for Ashok, please leave them in the comments. We'll share them with Ashok and we'll get you the answers. And you also can share with us what more do you want to hear, what are the questions that you really want answered by the tech rainmakers here. So thank you so much for your time, Ashok. It was amazing having you on Tech Rainmakers today.
Well, thank you again. I'm very humbled to even to have been asked, and I hope that this continues to be a long path of evolution for Venture 7 and for the series.
Thank you so much.